I've done this particular one, election year issues for private foundations and public charities, many, many times over since probably the mid 1990s. A lot of the rules don't change very much. Some of them do, but a lot of it's the same thing. And refreshers are good for people who have been working in the field for a long time. But I also try to present this material for people who are new to the field and may not know all the basic rules. So I'm going to cover both basics and some of the more in-depth issues. So with that, Margaret, can you go to the next slide and we'll get into the meat of it? But yeah, right there, different person, different rules. So much of the discussion about election year issues, what the issues are, depends on who the person is that's asking the question. Election year issues for private individuals are very different than the rules that apply to a PAC, a political action committee. Trade associations have their own set of rules for election year issues. Social welfare organizations, also referred to as 501c4s, they are not limited exclusively to advocacy and policy issues, but that is the biggest use of C4s right now. Then the main focus of what we're talking about today is public charities, which are 501c3 organizations that are also described as public charities in 509A1, A2, or A3. So that's where you find A1, A2, and A3 is where you find the definition of a public charity. Organizations that don't meet those particular criteria are private foundations, and they have a different set of rules. Then two other subcategories of public charities are donor advised funds and churches, and they have their own set of rules as well. So the main focus today is really on the basics for public charities and private foundations, and we'll touch on some of these other categories a little bit as we go through. But the primary purpose is to get a good grounding for public charities and private foundations. So let's start at the big picture. Where do we get the defining language, and why do we even worry about election year issues for public charities and private foundations? Well, the answer is right there in Internal Revenue Code 501c3. This slide is just the portion that applies to the purposes we're talking about today. There's a lot more in 501c3, but the specific language, and I have in bold the parts that I talk about on and on and on. And I could certainly talk for more than an hour, but I'm going to try to keep it at that. So the key words we're going to be working on today are: it's an organization organized and operated for charitable purposes, no substantial part, and we're going to talk about that for several slides, of which is carrying on propaganda, and we'll talk about that, or otherwise attempting to influence legislation, and we'll talk about what legislation means, because it's not always, there's nuance to that, except as otherwise provided in subsection H. Many of you have probably heard of the 501H election. This is a reference to 501H, and which organization does not participate in or intervene in, including the publishing or distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. So that's a ton of rules in those 5.5 lines. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So going on to the next slide. Remember that public charities and private foundations are using, for the most part, sometimes they have earned income, but for the most part, they're using tax deductible contributions or tax exempt income to do certain things. And that's the point of these lobbying and candidate electioneering limitations, is that Congress didn't want charitable organizations engaging in politics using deductible money. And there's, we can have a policy debate, but that's what drives all this. So there are some carve-outs. Public charities may do all of these things listed here. They can engage in a limited amount of lobbying activity, and we'll talk about this at length in a little bit. including ballot measure advocacy. Public charities are permitted to conduct public education and training about how to participate in legislative campaigns and civic and policy-oriented efforts, because that's education. Education and training is an exempt activity. Public charities are also permitted to carry out activities that educate the candidates about issues, and also legislators about issues. They're also permitted to canvass or poll the public on policy issues. So there's a lot that a public charity can do. Moving on to the next slide, there are a handful of things that a public charity can do with certain restrictions that are spelled out in the Treasury regs. They can prepare questionnaires that go out to the candidates that ask them about their position on issues. They can publish candidate qualifications. They can sponsor candidate debates. They can conduct voter registration drives. So all of these things that I've just talked about in the previous slide and this slide are focused a great deal on the intervening in a campaign, a candidate's campaign for public office. We'll get to lobbying later, but right now we're just thinking about candidate campaigns. So you can see that public charities are allowed to do a fair amount. Now, private foundations can also be involved in certain advocacy activities. And this slide is a summary of things we'll get to a little bit later. Private foundations can't engage in legislative lobbying at all, which I just mentioned, public charities can. And they can't intervene in any candidate campaigns. But they are allowed to engage in nonpartisan analysis, study, or research. That's not candidate campaigning, and that's not legislative lobbying. They can provide technical advice to legislative bodies. They can defend their tax status in legislation. That's the self-defense exception. They can work on the examination and discussion of broad social, economic, or similar problems, climate change, environmental issues, educate, the whole slew of charitable activities. And they can engage in administrative activities, appearances before and acting, engaging in activities to lobby administrative bodies. And we'll go into more detail on that in a little bit. So private foundations can do quite a few things, but they do have a hard stop at certain areas. So moving on, touching briefly on C3s and C4s, and I noticed there was one advanced question about talking about organizations that have tandem public charities and social welfare or C4 organizations. That's a fairly complicated topic, but as many of you know, it's very common for public charities that have a particular issue area to have a sister or related organization that's recognized under C4 that has more flexibility in policy activities. A C4 still is required to be operated primarily to advance the common good and general welfare of people within the community. The distinction, though, is that contributions to a C4 are not tax deductible to the donor. Its earnings are, a C4 is tax exempt in the sense that it doesn't pay tax on its income, but donations are not tax deductible. So they're not subsidized by the federal and state governments who forego a tax deduction. Who forego the taxes when a donor makes a tax deduction. Another distinction that is more solidly in place for the C4 is that the names of their donors aren't subject to disclosure to the IRS on the Form 990. That's an area, the confidentiality of donors comes and goes over the years, depending on the administration and state law things. So that's another hot topic that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on today. So that's the basic landscape of a social welfare organization. And when you have a C3 with a tandem C4, you can use the same staff, but you've got to have very good expense sharing and staff sharing agreements to make sure that the work is done on the right side of the balance sheet. So the current rules for 501c4 organization, just real quickly here, they can engage in unlimited lobbying for their social purpose. They can engage in unlimited nonpartisan political activities. That they can't participate, they can't engage in direct or indirect intervention in a political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to a candidate. That would throw them into the PAC and other categories. But they have much more flexibility to engage in political campaigns. The current IRS policy is that there's quite a bit of flexibility for C4s as long as their primary activity is promotion of the social welfare. And they measure that by no more than 40% of the expenditures and staff time is spent on political campaign activities. And at least 60% of expenditures is spent on activities that promote their social welfare purpose. So that's where the C4s fit in the landscape. So thinking specifically about prohibited political campaign activities, these are things that neither a public charity nor a private foundation can do. And it's really important to not have a foot fault in these categories because it jeopardizes the exempt status altogether. 501c3 organizations can't endorse a candidate for public office. They can't urge the public to vote for or against a specific candidate. They're not permitted to contribute money to an election campaign. Supporting or forming a political action committee is not allowed for a 501c3. They can't provide their mailing lists or email lists, their IP to any candidate. They can't score or grade candidates. They're not permitted to provide campaign workers to campaigns for public office. It's not permitted to support political party platforms. And here's an important reminder is that they can't, a public charity or private foundation can't include a link to a candidate or a PAC website on its own, on the foundation or charity website. There's generally a one-click rule. It's okay to link to another site where that site links to a candidate or a PAC, but you can't have a direct link to a candidate or PAC message. Which can be kind of tricky because depending on who you link to, those pages may change. And if you're linking to something and they change the page and it's got candidate activity, you could have a problem. So it's important to be careful about who you're linking to. So let's take a closer look at scoring or looking at candidate records. There are many charities that survey all the candidates for a particular office on particular issues. The allowable candidate scoring for a foundation or a public charity is prescribed in this revenue ruling here, 80-282. And basically it says, if you're going to do candidate scoring, you have to cover many issues, a wide range of issues. You can't give any implication of the surveying organization's views on the topics. They can use the candidate scoring for their members only, but not use this tool to try to increase their membership. They can't target an election. They're not allowed to refer to incumbents in office to distinguish between who's on which candidate is an incumbent and which is a new, competing for that seat. And there needs to be a disclaimer that fits within the special rules of this guidance. So if an organization, the takeaway from this slide is if an organization wants to do candidate surveying or scoring on various topics, be very careful to fit within the requirements of these applicable rules. So as I'm thinking about a public charity and reminding staff of what they can and can't do during this election year. We've got the next 6 months will be pretty heated by all current commentary that we're seeing. It's important to remind staff that all the communications, including intentional advocacy communications and also fundraising communications and educational communications, it's really important that the staff watch out for messages that distort the facts or use code words. Red and blue are, historic code words. There's more current ones that would apply in this campaign, things like, I don't know, climate change or certain things around COVID and mask mandates. Those things might end up being code words in this current climate. So if you use code words, emotional appeal that's unsupported by reasoned analysis, and the facts are distorted, the IRS could determine that type of a communication is actually intended to be supporting or opposing a particular candidate. So it's really important to look at the entire context of a communication and make sure that it's not, people aren't trying to influence a campaign in some sideways fashion. So that's a little bit about communication strategy. And so when I give these seminars in person, somebody always raises their hand and says, but wait a minute, I have rights to, can't I say what I think about the candidates, even though I'm the executive director or on the board of a charity or a foundation? Yes, of course, individuals don't lose their right to campaign for candidates or oppose candidates just because they're on a board. But it's extremely important that campaign activity doesn't happen at official functions or functions where the organization is, where it's an organizational activity. And at other functions, when people are mentioned in a program with the name of their organization, it's permissible under the rules to identify the nonprofit, the charity that the speaker is a person is involved with, for identification only. So that is allowed. Next slide, Margaret. Oh, yes, there's the identification only. I forgot that one has a little slide in. So another question that often comes up is, can I, as a staff person or board member at a charity or a foundation, use any charity resources when participating in a campaign activity? So here, it's really important to remember that using your email address or the charity website or social media, inadvertently using, nobody uses letterhead anymore, but using the firm email to send communications about a candidate, absolutely not allowed. You shouldn't use your .org address if that's associated with your public charity or private foundation to send candidate intervention communications. You can't use paid time off. Well, that's not true. You can't use non-paid time off, work your work day to support a candidate activity. This really comes up with the other way around, where a charity or a foundation says, can't I just send my employees to support X, Y, or Z candidate activity? No, they can use their PTO or their vacation time to do whatever they want, but they can't use work time to intervene. And obviously a charity can't give cash or resources or mailing lists or anything else to a candidate campaign. There are some job duties that require a staff person to understand what's going on in a political campaign. Obviously, that's okay if the job duty requires knowledge about campaigns, that's fine, but that's not an intervention. You can't participate in the campaign or intervene as part of the job duty. So coming back to candidate questionnaires and voter guides, those can be permitted if under all the facts and circumstances, the voter guide and the questionnaire is is educational and is not intended to be an intervention. So the facts and circumstances that the rules look at are, first, whether the questions are clear and unbiased in both their structure and content. The questions that are actually given to the candidates in a live forum are the same as the questions that are or not. It's not so much a live forum. It's that the questions to the candidates and what's published in the guide that goes out to the public has to be the same. You can't ask the candidate one thing and then report it as an answer to a different question in the voter guide. So it needs to be verbatim. Candidates should be allowed to explain their answer. Yes, no answers are not preferred by the IRS. The candidate responses shouldn't be edited. All the candidates for a particular office should be included in the voter guide, and the scope of the questions should be appropriate to the candidate, the office that the candidate's running for. Some rules about candidate appearances are on this slide. It's really tricky to invite a candidate to speak as a candidate, because you're going to have to allow all candidates to participate, and there can't be any indication of support or opposition. So that's a pretty high bar. If it's set up as a forum or a debate, in reality, it has to show no bias, with an independent panel, a broad range of topics, equal opportunities to express views, no challenge to the candidates to agree or disagree, and the moderator can't comment for or against. Now, you may be thinking, as I am, back to certain very interesting debates that we've seen in the recent past. Those were not run by public charities by and large. So these are the rules that apply when a public charity is, as part of its educational mission, providing a forum or a debate for the candidates. So that's the distinction. If it's not a charity supported or a foundation run event, then they can do whatever they want. Candidates, just because someone is a candidate for office doesn't mean that they can't speak at your events, but they do need to really not be campaigning during that event. Next slide. What are we up to now, Margaret? So voter registration and get out the vote. Many public charities do voter registration activities. There's limits on how private foundations can support that, and I'll get to that in a minute. But when a public charity engages in the activity of registering voters, they must follow these rules. They have to be very careful to not be carrying out the activity with the intent of registering only or getting out the vote only from one side of the political spectrum. So many private foundations are asked to fund, give grants to public charities for these voter registration and get out the vote drives. And if you go to the next slide, Margaret, you can see here I've excerpted the provisions from Internal Revenue Code 4942F, which describes the circumstances under which a foundation can make grants to a public charity that does voter registration drives. And it's a pretty stringent set of rules, but foundations don't need to really focus on these rules because they have to get from the charity their 4942F ruling letter. So the way that charities proceed with this, if they're going to do voter registration drives, and they want foundation grants, they go to the IRS and get a 4942F ruling that says they do in fact meet all of these criteria. That is, they do voter registration drives, not just for one particular election period. They carry it on in 5 or more states. Substantially all of their income is spent for the active conduct of the activities that constitute their exempt purpose. Substantially all of their support is from the public and not more than 25% from one organization. And the contributions for voter registration drives can't be conditioned on specific states or election periods. So it's a pretty stringent set of rules. But on the other hand, it does give private foundations the ability to support voter registration, which is an important part of the civic process. So that's the lay of the land for candidate intervention and candidate campaign intervention. Shifting gears now, there's some overlap with policy advocacy and legislative lobbying, because as we all know, there is legislation that's often put up for the vote in a particular election year. Here in California, we often have ballot initiatives that coincide with candidate elections. So there's some overlap, and sometimes the ballot initiatives are used as a tool to get out the vote. But anyway, I won't get into policy stuff on that at that level. But back to some of the do's. What is okay for public charities and private foundations? Well, to recap a little bit of what I said at the outset, when a charity, either a public charity or a private foundation, they are allowed to advocate and talk about policy positions that are within their mission description, that address broad social, economic, and similar issues, that are not propaganda and that aren't coded to oppose or support a particular candidate. So moving on to the next slide, for a private foundation that's looking, or a public charity for that matter, that's looking at grant proposals, and I see a lot of this at this time of year, the really active, the activist public charities right now are trying to gain as much grant money, grant funding for their activities through the election with proposals. And when reading those proposals, it's really important to look at the entire picture and discern whether the proposal is truly nonpartisan, that covers permitted. I always look for whether there's an impermissible activity hidden in a proposal. One bad apple can ruin the entire, for my clients anyway, I would tell them, if the proposal has something that's not allowed, just send it back and ask that it be rewritten to leave out the things that you can't fund. It's important that the proposal and the activities are influencing public policy. Of course, that's fine, but not by influencing candidates directly or influencing voters to vote for or against candidates. And we know every election cycle, we see a lot of that. I watch for grant proposals where the activity is coordinated between the charity and a related C4 organization or a political action committee. Obviously, red flags come up if you see that the proposal includes activities that are intended to coincide with the election cycle or the ballot initiative. And if I'm a private foundation and the goal of the proposal can be achieved only by the success of a legislative proposal, that would be a red flag for a private foundation funder as well. So backing up to that one, there's a couple of other points I wanted to make about grant proposals that private foundations can fund for lobbying activities. Many of you may have faced this conundrum that there's a special rule that a general support grant from a private foundation to a public charity that lobbies, general support grants are fine. It's when the grant from the private foundation to the public charity is restricted for a particular project that the private foundation has to look very carefully at whether the project proposal and budget can support their grant. So if it's a restricted grant to an organization that lobbies for a project that includes a lobbying component, the foundation grant amount can't exceed the non-lobbying portion of the public charities budget. And the idea there, it makes sense. If you're giving more than what you know they're going to spend on non-lobbying, you must be intending for some of your support to go to lobbying activities. But conversely, there's a safe harbor that if your private foundation grant is less than the non-lobbying portion, you won't be your restricted project grant won't be treated as a lobbying grant. And this sort of, in reality, it means that you might have, a number, get all of the support from private foundations in amounts that are less than the non-lobbying portion of the budget, but obviously all the private foundation money is used for lobbying and non-lobbying activities. But it doesn't matter. The safe harbor protects the private foundation anyway, as long as their grant amount doesn't exceed the non-lobbying portion of the budget. There's another caveat, and that is that the private foundation grant for the project can't earmark money for lobbying. It can only be for a project that includes the lobbying and non-lobbying components. So the other really important note here is that so many of these activities are carried out as sponsored projects through a fiscal sponsor. A grant to a fiscally sponsored project is a restricted grant. So there's no way you can actually do a general support grant for a fiscally sponsored project. You're going to have to fit as a private foundation within this rule that I just described in order to make a grant to a sponsored project that includes a non-lobbying component. You're going to have to make sure that your portion of that project budget is not more than the non-lobbying portion. So now, hopefully that didn't confuse you all, but if you want me to send you the site to that reg, I'm happy to send that and explain that in further detail. So now we can move on to some definitional terms. Where are we going next? To what's this page? Shifting gears, thinking about public charities and what public charities are allowed to do and where the limits are for a public charity that wants to engage in lobbying. So now we're in the side of the charitable sector where you can engage in lobbying, but no substantial amount can be lobbying. And as you may recall from that early slide, that's where this language comes from. The original 501c3 language is entirely subjective. There are no bright lines. There's no safe harbor. There's a very old case that suggests that 5% is not substantial. But there's nothing in the statute that measures this 5% by expenditures. So it's a very amorphous subjective test. But as many of you know, the saving grace is one can make a 501h election, and that's on the next slide. So the 501h election, if made by a public charity, gives the organization an objective test of what a substantial part means. And you can see on this slide the objective dollar amounts for expenditures. So now we don't have to worry about volunteer activities or staff time or whatever. The substantiality of the lobbying activities is measured just on the basis of the proportion of the lobbying amounts as compared to exempt purpose expenditures. And it's a sliding scale. For small organizations under 500,000, they can spend 20% on lobbying activities. And you can see it ratchets down. And then once they reach exempt purpose expenditures over 1.5 million, the limit is 5%. Of that amount under the 501h election, grassroots expenditures can't exceed 25% of the allowable lobbying non-taxable amount. So ratcheting down from a quarter of 20% or 5% down to a quarter of 5% or 1.25%. So the grassroots lobbying is a much lower limit. And the other catch, if the 501H election is made, is that there's an affiliated entity rule that applies. So you can't increase your 501H limit beyond $1 million just by carving up your lobbying into different organizations. If they're related, they're all going to be aggregated. Yes, let's move on to the next slide, and then I'll come back to defining direct and grassroots lobbying. Remember, we've talked about this. You've seen this in the private foundation slides a few minutes ago. There are certain things that aren't counted in your lobbying expenditures at all. Expenses for nonpartisan analysis, study, and research, discussions and activities related to social, economic, and similar problems that are broad in nature. Requests for technical advice when a public charity responds to a legislative committee chair request for technical information about a proposed piece of legislation. That's not counted in lobbying expenditures. Self-defense lobbying expenditures are not counted, and activities to address administrative rules and regulations also are not lobbying. So, and that's an important distinction. Legislative lobbying only means legislation that is to be acted upon by an elected body. An administrative body is not an elected body. They're by definition, they're appointed people on making up those administrative rules, and activities engaged in or expenditures for those activities is not legislative lobbying, it's administrative lobbying, and you can spend as much as you want on that. And then there's advocacy communications, and these also have a special rule. So advocacy is a statement about a particular piece of legislation that expresses a view for or against the legislation, but doesn't go so far as to include a call to action. So that advocates a view, but it doesn't lobby. And if you move to the next slide, we'll talk about what direct lobbying is. So we move from advocacy to direct lobbying, where the expense matters, when the communication is directed to the legislator or the government official. It refers to specific legislation, which includes non-binding resolutions of a legislative body, treaties. Foreign laws are included in this as well. But the specific legislation, note that the specific legislation doesn't have to be introduced yet. It can still be legislation where a lobbying group is shopping it around to legislators or their staff. It's still legislation once it's been written as a statute. A direct lobbying communication reflects a view on the legislation. And so if it meets those three criteria, directed to the legislator, as in it's a communication to Senator X, Representative Y, refers to the specific legislation and reflects a view on it, good, bad, that makes it a lobbying activity. Now here, you can see at the bottom, a special note, for a ballot initiative, the legislator is the public. So you can have direct legislative lobbying to the public when directing a communication to the public, referring to specific legislation and reflecting a view on it. Now, next slide, I'll talk about grassroots lobbying. Grassroots is different from direct because it refers to the legislation, reflects a view, but it encourages the recipient to call their legislator, to contact their legislator to take action. Now, why is there a distinction? I mean, they're very similar. Why would there be different expenditure limits? Well, the reason is it used to be very expensive to do grassroots lobbying. Do you remember when we still do get all this stuff in the mail? The limit on grassroots lobbying is much, much lower than the direct lobbying expenditure limitation. And this was an desire by the legislators, by Congress, to make it more difficult for charities to use money to engage in grassroots lobbying. Now it's kind of flipped because all the lobbying is electronic. The cost of it is much, much lower. You can reach a huge number of people through social media and email campaigns and the like. That doesn't cost anywhere near what grassroots lobbying used to cost when it was done only through the mail or other hard copy versions. But anyway, that's a distinction and a little bit of history on grassroots lobbying and direct lobbying. So what are we up to now? So here's an example. When I was looking at this, and Margaret reminded me this morning that much of my presentation is very dated. This is an ancient Outlook version. See how few tabs there are? I mean, it was so easy to use back then. Anyway, back in the day when I first did this slide, I used this example, a communication to the public that says the Senate is considering a bill. This bill prevents dangerous criminals from buying handguns that criminals can use to attack you and your family. The safety of every family in America is at stake. A communication like that it refers to specific legislation. It reflects a view on the legislation, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't have a call to action. So an expenditure for something like this is not treated as a lobbying expense. Grassroots, it's not a grassroots lobbying expense because there's no call to action. So next slide, Margaret. Here's another one that's it talks about a particular piece of legislation. It's very educational. It talks about the specific details. But if you notice, if you click on it, Margaret, it'll circle the key language. The call to action language is down there at the bottom. Once you cross that line, the communication is a lobbying communication and falls within the expense budgets of the set forth in the 501H rules. So there you have it. So the other, a really important point to think about in making the 501H election, when it first came about, it was a godsend because the no substantial part was so vague that it was really hard for organizations to do any amount of lobbying because they couldn't know if it would be viewed by the IRS as substantial or not. And so the 501H election gave everybody some bright lines. But back in the day when 501H was adopted, I don't remember the exact year. I think it was before the turn of the century in the late 90s, but it may have been later than that. I think it was earlier. Anyway, $1 million went a lot further back then. And so this $1 million cap was beyond what most organizations would do anyway. There was a lot of concern back then that if an organization made the election, they would have to report more information to the IRS. And so as the years have gone by, it's become clear that the IRS does not target organizations that have made 501H elections, but it also, the $1 million doesn't go very far. And the disclosures on the 990 are actually a bit more onerous if you don't make the election. So what I clipped here is the 2021 Schedule C. This slide shows the disclosure if the organization has made a 501H election, and it shows, it's just not all that onerous for an organization that makes the 501H. And the next slide, the disclosure if the organization hasn't filed a 501H election is actually quite detailed. I think someone had asked in advance of this webinar that I talk a little bit about record keeping to support these schedules. This is really where the heart of it goes. For an organization that either has or hasn't made a 501H election, you still want internally the records that show how much you've spent in all these categories for direct activities. And then if you've made grants to other organizations for lobbying, you'll also need to keep track of lobbying grants that are made. How are we doing on time? I think there's just a few more minutes before I'll open it up for comments. And I know I've thrown a lot at you, but I have a few slides here that I won't go into in great detail that address the state law issues. So everything we've been talking about so far has revolved around the Internal Revenue Code, the federal laws. California also has some advocacy reporting requirements, and these are very different in purpose and operation. The one that catches a lot of private foundations and public charities is that any organization that directly or indirectly makes payments over the $5,000 threshold in any calendar quarter to influence legislative or administrative actions has to report those expenditures to the California FPPC. This is for state legislation, not federal legislation. But you notice there's a key word in there. It says legislative or administrative actions. So this isn't limited just to legislative lobbying, as I harped on and on about a few minutes ago. It includes administrative actions. So next slide, Margaret. Here's the key points, the key takeaways here. If your foundation or charity is making direct or indirect payments in any calendar quarter to influence or attempt to influence administrative action by a state legislator, a state agency, or any elected state officials, then the expenditures have to be reported. Next slide. So administrative actions are much broader than legislative lobbying. It includes all the things on this slide: a proposal, expenditures for drafting, developing, considering, amending, enacting, or defeating any state agency action relating to a rule, a regulation, an executive order, a rate-making proceeding, and other decisions that establish official policies. So it's pretty broad. So really important to keep that in mind. Next slide. So here's some examples that come up in California. And again, my apologies to our participants who aren't in California. I know this is of less interest to many of you. And I don't know the state laws, similar state laws in other states. Next slide. Certain activities aren't administrative actions, so not everything is covered. Next slide. Oh, the state officials. So this is important to keep in mind. These are the kinds of folks that a foundation or a charity effort might be focused on. Governor, constitutional officers like insurance commissioner, school boards, members of the Board of Equalization, directors of state agencies, staff members of state agencies, if they make direct communication with any of these officials. So it's pretty broad when advocating in California. Next slide. Clerical, secretarial, ministerial individuals aren't a problem for these rules. Local, I said school board, so that wouldn't necessarily be applied. I shouldn't have said that. Members of local government or local agencies aren't covered by the California state advocacy rules, and obviously federal government and federal agency officials aren't covered. So that's all I can throw at you